Perfect. So let's start right at the basics. When we say alma-casa, what are we really talking about? What's the core definition?
Okay, fundamentally, alma-casa is defined as dropping a debt you're owed by someone in exchange for a debt that you owe to that same person.
So like a mutual cancellation.
Exactly. It's all about canceling out debts between two people when they each owe the other something. If I owe you 10 quid and you owe me 10 quid, we just cancel it. No need to actually swap the cash.
Right, makes sense. So that definition seems pretty clear, but does alma-casa cover any way a debt might disappear? Or is it more specific? Like, what does the standard say it doesn't cover?
That's a really important point. The standard is quite precise. It only covers extinguishing an obligation through this mutual set-off, alma-casa.
Yeah.
It specifically excludes other ways debts can end. Things like discharge. That's where I just let you off the hook. Forgive the debt, not mutual.
Right, that's different.
Or transfer, where the debt gets moved to someone else. There's also settlement, like a compromise, or rescission, canceling the whole contract. Even something called rightful appropriation, which is basically taking what's yours if you can. So understanding these differences really highlights how specific alma-casa is. It's a very particular tool for mutual debt cancellation, not just any debt resolution.
Got it. So it's not just one simple thing. And you mentioned different flavors. The standard actually breaks alma-casa down, starting with something called obligatory set-off. What does obligatory mean here?
Right. Obligatory set-off, or JA wajibiyah, happens either, well, compulsorily or by obligation. I might bind both people involved or maybe just one.
Yeah.
And even within this obligatory category, there are actually two distinct subtypes.
Okay.
The first one is called compulsory set-off, or JA.
Gabriya, compulsory.
Yeah. This is where the debts basically just fall away automatically, often without anyone needing to ask for it or even agree to it at that moment.
Yeah.
Sometimes, though, it might need one person's consent.
Wow, okay. That's just falling away automatically sounds like it must have some really strict requirements. What needs to be true for that to happen?
Oh, absolutely. The conditions for compulsory set-off are very strict. Okay, first, each person has to be both a creditor and a debtor to the other person at the same time.
Okay, mutual debts.
Yep. Second, and this is crucial, the debts have to be, and I quote, equal in type, quality, and maturity or due date.
Equal on everything, pretty much.
Pretty much. Same kind of thing, same quality, due at the same time. Third, if the amounts aren't identical, say you owe me 100 pounds, I owe you 70 pounds, the set-off only happens for the amount they have in common. So 70 pounds gets canceled, and you'd still owe me 30 pounds.
Makes sense.
And finally, the whole thing must not lead to a Shari'ah-prohibited outcome. That's a fundamental check.
Right, an ethical backstop.
Exactly. Now, the second subtype under obligatory is request-based set-off, or chalabiyah.
Request-based.
In this case, the debts fall because the person who holds what's called the superior right asks for it. And importantly, that person has to agree to waive their superior right.
Yeah.
This can happen even if the other person doesn't agree.
Interesting. So how do the conditions for this request-based type stack up against the compulsory one? Is it a bit looser because it involves a request?
There are similarities, but also a key subtle difference. Okay, so again, each party must be a creditor and debtor to the other. That's the same. But critically, it needs the consent of the party with the superior right to waive their right. So whoever has the better claim has to agree to give up that advantage.
Okay.
And the debts. There needs to be similarity of debts in type, not necessarily gender, but in quality and maturity.
Not necessarily gender. What does that mean practically?
Well, it suggests a little more flexibility than the compulsory type. The debts need to be in a similar basic category, like maybe two types of grain or two different services, but they don't have to be absolutely identical in every single respect. Still need similarity in quality and due date, though.
Gotcha. Bit more wiggle room.
A little bit. And just like before, if the amounts differ, set-off is only for the common amount. And again, it must not lead to a prohibited outcome.
Okay, so those are the obligatory types. But you mentioned the standard also talks about a more flexible way, right? Consensual set-off. Sounds like agreement is key there.
Exactly right. Consensual set-off, or say itisakea, is all about mutual agreement. Both parties explicitly agree to extinguish the debts between them. They choose to do it.
So what are the conditions needed for that one?
For consensual set-off, you still need the first condition. Each party is both a creditor and a debtor to the other.
Okay.
But the big one is, it requires the consent of each party to the set-off. Both have to be on board.
Makes sense, hence consensual.
Precisely. And like all the others, it must not lead to a Sharia-prohibited outcome.
So the conditions seem similar in some ways, but what's the really big difference? What makes this consensual type so much more, well, adaptable? This feels like the really useful part.
This is where it gets really flexible, you're right. The key thing, the aha moment, as you said, is that consensual set-off is allowed even if the type, nature, quality, and maturity of the debts are different.
Ah, okay, that's the big deal.
Huge difference. It means parties can agree to cancel out debts that would never qualify under those stricter obligatory rules. Maybe you owe me for, say, consulting services, and I owe you rent for equipment. Totally different types of debt.
Right.
Under consensual set-off, if we both agree, we can still cancel them out against each other. It opens up way more possibilities for managing debts efficiently, especially when things are complex.
And if the amounts are different?
Simple. If the amounts differ, the person owed the larger amount just retains the right to claim the difference from the other party. It's that mutual agreement that unlocks this broader application.
That clarifies it nicely. Okay, so we know the types. What about thinking ahead? Can you agree to do this, like for debts that haven't even happened yet? And how does this actually work in today's financial systems?
Good question. Yes, the standard addresses this. It talks about a promise to perform set-off. A little quote. Local haruzat al-mua de la jetra al-makwasa.
A promise.
Exactly. It says it's permissible between institutions and their clients, or between institutions themselves, for debts that may arise in the future.
Okay, so banks and customers, or banks dealing with other banks?
Precisely. The key thing to remember, though, is that when those future debts actually come into existence, the conditions we've talked about for either obligatory or consensual set-off still have to be met at that time.
Right. The promise doesn't override the underlying rules. What if those future debts are in, say, different currencies, euros and dollars, for example? That seems common.
Very common. And the standard covers it. If the debts are in different currencies, the promise to set them off is based on the exchange rate that exists at the time the set-off actually happens.
Ah, the spot rate at the time of cancellation, not when the promise was made.
Exactly. It uses the current market value.
Okay, practical stuff. So let's zoom in on some of those contemporary applications the standard mentions. Where do we see al-Muqasa being used in the real financial world today?
Well, the standard points out a few key areas. One is stipulating al-Muqasa in debts from forward sales between, say, a bank and its client.
Forward sales, like futures or forward contracts.
Could be, or other deferred payment sales. You can build the set-off agreement right into the initial contract, saying any future debts arising from this deal can be offset. Whether it ends up being obligatory or consensual depends on if the conditions match up later. Doing it up front just makes things smoother.
Avoids haggling later.
Right. Another major one is set-off between institutions clearing checks through clearinghouses. Think about all the checks flying between banks.
Yeah, huge volumes.
Al-Muqasa is basically how they efficiently settle the net amounts owed between them, rather than sending every single payment back and forth. It's fundamental to payment systems.
Okay.
And similarly, it's used for set-off between institutions via global or local networks. Big financial players often owe each other money across various transactions, and netting these out via al-Muqasa is just efficient treasury management.
So it's really embedded in the plumbing of finance.
Very much so. And in all these modern cases, again, whether it qualifies as obligatory or consensual set-off, depends entirely on meeting those specific conditions we discussed earlier for each situation.
Makes sense. Now, we spent a lot of time on what al-Muqasa is, but the sources also seem to flag something specific related to exchange that's not allowed under these rules. What's that about?
That's right. It's important to know the boundaries. The standard specifically mentions cash barter, or CAUSC, al-Muqada al-Nadia.
Cash barter.
And it states very clearly that cash barter that is based on usury, or rikada, is not permissible.
Okay, so any kind of cash-for-cash swap that effectively involves interest is out.
Precisely. This prohibition, really, it just highlights the ethical framework underpinning all these Sharia financial standards. There's constant attention paid to avoiding practices like riba that are considered exploitative or unjust. It shapes the whole approach.
Got it. So we've covered quite a bit of ground here. We've defined al-Muqasa, looked at the obligatory versus consensual types, dug into the specific conditions for each.
The nitty-gritty details.
And even seen how it's used in modern banking and finance. Hopefully that's given you listening some real clarity on this. Maybe a few aha moments.
Yeah, what strikes me is how this concept, al-Makasa, offers such a, well, a structured and detailed method for managing obligations. It's not just a vague idea, it's quite meticulous, reflecting a principled approach to finance.
So what's the takeaway for you listening? Well, you basically got a great head start now on understanding a specific and pretty important financial tool. We've tried to cut through the jargon and give you the core ideas clearly.
And perhaps it leaves us with a thought. In today's incredibly complex financial world, could looking at these kinds of principle-based methods for handling debt, like al-Makasa, offer us fresh perspectives? Maybe even spark ideas for, I don't know, more ethical or innovative financial solutions moving forward.
Definitely something to think about. As always, keep digging deep into the topics that catch your interest. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.